Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fanfiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Even without a quirk, can I still be a hero, like you? Midoriya Izuku, a quirkless teenager with seemingly no other special skills other than hero analysis, almost couldn't comprehend how the situation turned out like this. He had a really shitty day, no thanks in part to his childhood friend turned bully, Bakugo Katsuki, telling him to end his life if he so desperately wanted a quirk. Then, he was almost killed by a sludge villain on his way home. Just when he thought that his life was coming to an end anyway, his childhood idol, the #1 hero in the country, All Might, came to his rescue. What should have been the end of that did not, as in desperation, Midoriya latched onto the hero's leg as he took off into the air, throwing his life into a second near-death experience in less than 5 minutes. For both of their safety, All Might landed on the roof of a building in the downtown core, and to Midoriya's shock, deflated into his true, emaciated form as Toshinori Yagi. Shock aside, realizing that he might never get another chance like this again, Midoriya asked the #1 hero the question that has been plaguing him since his diagnosis as quirkless. The answer that came would forever alter his life. "I'm sorry, kiddo, you can't be a hero without a quirk. You can't be a hero without a quirk. You can't, without quirk. You can't. You can't. You can't." Those dreaded words, said with pity, repeated themselves over and over in Midoriya's head, long after he excused himself from All Might's presence and left the building. His own childhood idol, the symbol of peace whom he had looked up to ever since he was a toddler, had destroyed his dreams, with such audacious pity that it made Midoriya nauseous, although that could also be attributed to the loud, heaving sobs that racked him when he numbly found himself at a small park and sat himself down on a bench. It would have been heart-wrenching for anyone to hear such sobs, and indeed it was. For Midoriya, the world had collapsed all around him. The one hope that he had for his dream had been severed. There was nothing left. All Might was just another figure, part of a long line of people who had shown him pity, or worse, disgust, for not having a quirk. There were 3 that stood out in prominence. "I'm sorry, but with the extra toe joint, it's irrefutable that Izuku would never have a quirk." That was his family doctor, stoic and professional, diagnosing him as quirkless. "I'm so sorry, Izuku." That was his mother, the only family he had left after his father left without a word, breaking down in tears when he, amidst his own tears, asked futilely if he could be a hero like All Might after that fateful medical appointment. He still remembered his mother embracing him as they both cried in his darkened bedroom, the only light coming from the computer screen featuring a smiling All Might. "If you're so desperate for a quirk, useless Deku, go and take a leap of faith off the roof. Hopefully, you'll get a quirk in your next life." That was Kaken, or Bakugo Katsuki. Childhood friend turned bully. The explosive blonde had been the source of many more insults and physical attacks, those of which Midoriya had already forgotten in an attempt to numb the pain of daily life. But those 2 sentences, spoken just hours before with such cruelty that it was almost impossible to believe that a human could possess such levels of malice, remained crystal clear in Midoriya's head. And now, All Might had joined the list. Pain. Unbearable, agonizing pain. That was what Midoriya felt now. He was bleeding out, emotionally, as if he had been stabbed 1,000 times and left to die. Indeed, he felt like he was dying. Everything that meant his very existence had been destroyed. There was nothing left to help him become the person he wanted to be. He was just Deku. Useless, quirkless Deku. Amidst his sobs, a scream retches out of his throat as his emotional casket explodes. It dies away into more hiccuped sobs, as the rush of emotion ebbs away, leaving behind an empty void never to be filled again. Slowly, the sobs too fade away as the green-haired teen ran out of tears to cry. He sits for a while more, heaving deeply to replenish the oxygen that he had been slowly depriving his lungs of from his sobs. Only when his breathing stabilizes, does Midoriya attempt to stand back up. He wavers, his legs numb from the lack of movement. Once he steadies, he looks up to the sky. What should have been the blue sky of the early evening with a smattering of yellows and orange from the setting sun was instead an ominous dark gray. The wind was picking up, as the clouds seemed to roll above the teen. A thunderstorm was coming, courtesy of a quick flash of light amidst the clouds, followed closely by a low rumble. Midoriya felt a strange crackling in the air, his curly locks unknowingly rising and standing on end. Gosh, I better get back before I dash. He was unable to finish the thought, for all of a sudden, there was a flash of blinding light. And then, pain. Midoriya felt his entire body seize up, followed by an ear-splitting scream. He didn't know it at that moment, but that scream was ringing from his own mouth. All he could see was a glaring, blinding white light. The pain was excruciating, it was like as if 1,000 knives were stabbing at every inch of his body. Every nerve ending seared as if they were on fire, just as physical fire began to erupt from the seams of his Gakuren and the tips of his hair. Midoriya felt his heart go haywire, beating faster and erratically, as his lungs felt like they were going to implode. It was an eternity of agony, when it had happened almost instantaneously, and ended just as quickly. Time appeared to slow, amidst unbearable pain. Suddenly, the white light vanished, leaving behind a vision of blurred, merging shapes and colors. Then came the seemingly slow descent towards the ground. Midoriya felt many things as he keeled over. He felt his lungs collapse and his breathing fade. An incessant ringing in his ears. His vision becoming blurrier and darker. The small flames that singed his hair and uniform. The leftover pain that still coursed through his fried nerves. His heart reaching breaking point, pulse fluctuating madly, before it slowed, and stopped. That was also the same moment his body hit the ground with a dull thud. And not a moment later, came the rain. First a droplet, then two, and then three, followed by more. Within seconds, a deluge of water poured from the heavens, splattering on Midoriya's body, now riddled with Lichtenberg scars running all over, crisscrossing and branching all over, from throughout his face to the tips of his fingers. The small flames that singed his hair and clothes fizzled out, defenseless against the watery onslaught. There he laid, prone against the rain, unnoticed by anyone as they rushed for shelter underneath umbrellas, newspapers, or bags. A minute passes, and there was another rumble of thunder, followed by another flash of light. Midoriya's body involuntarily jerked as a second bolt of lightning struck him, directly over his silent heart. Thunder followed, almost instantaneously, with a deafening crash and roar. The noise faded, but the bolts of electricity from the second strike didn't. It crackled wildly within him, centering on a certain spot in between his lungs, where a dull mass of energy laid. Sparking with the currents, the mass glowed, losing its dull shade for brightness. The electricity then shot towards his heart, before spreading along the silent arteries and veins of his body. Every organ, muscle, bone, nerve and tendon were all enveloped by the electricity. Midoriya's brain, the last remaining organ to have not yet shut down from the fatal first strike, was the last to be taken over by the crackling bolts. All the while, green bolts of electricity pulsed and crackled all over his prone form, the Lichtenberg scars glowing a jade green color, starting from over his heart, traveling along and ending at the tips of his fingers and toes. The electricity inside of him continued to pulse, getting fiercer over his heart, body, and mind. His chest started rising and falling slowly, oxygen steadily returning into his system. Then, all of a sudden, Midoriya's eyelids snapped open, revealing blank, dull eyes. The irises were no longer their forest green color. Instead, like the light pulsing along his scars, they were a jade green. A vibrant, beautiful color, but at the same time, desaturated and faded. As if there, but at the same time, not quite there. Still crackling with green electricity and glowing jade from his scars, Midoriya slowly picked himself up from the wet ground. He stepped over to where his bag lay, abandoned and drenched, picked it up, and slung it over his shoulder. And, with the rain still pouring down around him in torrents, Midoriya sauntered out of the park, as if he hadn't been struck dead by lightning and revived by the same force of nature less than a few minutes ago. Midoriya finally reached his apartment block. Heaven knows how much longer he took to make the journey thanks to the rain and given the fact he sauntered all the way. During that time, he was struck by lightning again, no less than 5 times. But these strikes were different. Far different. Midoriya felt nothing whenever the lightning hit his body. Maybe the electricity coursing over his exposed skin and singed Gokuren and seeping into his body, but no pain or anything uncomfortable. Alright, feeling the electricity being absorbed into his body was something he was unfamiliar with, but it wasn't bad per se. It was just unusual, but not unpleasant. Midoriya finally reached the front door. He pressed the doorbell, inadvertently draining the battery of its voltage into his system as he pulled his finger away, cutting the chime off halfway. He waited impassively as hurried footsteps raced for the door. It was quickly pulled open by his frantic mother, Inko. Izuku! Oh my goodness! Where were you? I tried calling you multiple times, and the storm outside was so ferocious, and dash. Inko's words died in her mouth, as she finally noticed the scars on her son, glowing green. Her eyes widened. Izuku, what happened to you? The teen replied stoically as he raised a hand, crackling with green electricity. Honestly, I don't know. But Mom, this feeling. There was a beat of silence, raising the tension. I've never felt so alive, Mom. Midoriya Inko was worried. It was 4:45. Her son should have been home more than an hour ago. But there was no sound of the doorbell ringing, no shouts of Mom, I'm home. And even if her son was going to be late coming home, he would have called her immediately. But no calls came, and all calls to her son's phone went unanswered. Furthermore, the sky had turned ominous by mid-afternoon, with the occasional flash and rumble in the distance. While Inko was sure Izuku had an umbrella in his backpack, that didn't stop the worry that continued to eat at her the longer time passed, with no sign of her son returning home evident. When it began to rain heavily, and the lightning and thunder getting stronger, Inko had half a mind to call the police to report her son's disappearance. But she stood fast to her belief that Izuku was capable of taking care of himself, and was making his way home as she marinated her worries. The doorbell suddenly ringing snapped the tension within Inko. She rushed for the door, not registering that the chime cut itself off before it could finish. Quickly peeking through the peephole, Inko felt her heart settle seeing her son standing outside. She threw the door open, meeting a soaking wet Izuku. Izuku! Oh my goodness! Where were you? I tried calling you multiple times, and the storm outside was so ferocious, and dash. Then, Inko noticed the glowing green Lichtenberg scars running all over her son's face. Her words died in her mouth. She stared in shock. Izuku, what happened to you? Inko watched her son raise a hand, green bolts of electricity crackling and running up and down from his fingers and lower arm. Honestly, I don't know. But Mom, this feeling. Her son trailed off, while her own eyes trailed over his singed Gokuren and hair, both drenched from the rain. I've never felt so alive, Mom. Midoriya could tell his appearance short-circuited his mother's brain. He didn't blame her, he was just as unclear as she was. But nothing was going to get cleared up if they were going to just stare at one another, unmoving, not doing anything. Mom, I'm soaked. Let me shower first, I'll explain what happened afterwards. Still stunned by the proceedings, Inko could only silently nod, moving out of the way to let her son enter the apartment. Midoriya sauntered towards the bathroom, leaving Inko behind and a trail of wet footprints, each crackling with a tiny bolt of electricity. Several moments passed, before the cogs in Inko's brain started working again. I think I'll make a cup of tea for Izuku and myself. Her mind set, Inko hurried to the kitchen to get the kettle going. However, just as she started the stove and placed the kettle on the ring, there was a loud boom. Inko jumped away from the stove on instinct. The loud noise was followed by something metallic banging against something, then what sounded like electricity going off. And then, the kitchen, no, the entire apartment, plunged into darkness, the fire in the stove ring extinguishing itself at the same time. Momentarily stunned by the sudden loss of power, Inko quickly reached for the drawers, rummaging through them for a torchlight. Finding one, she turned it on, a single beam of light piercing the darkness. Sorry. Inko spun around, aiming the torchlight at the monotonous voice. Against the beam of light stood her son, dripping wet, scars still glowing over his exposed body, electric bolts crackling like nobody's business, and a towel wrapped around his private areas. Should have known taking a shower while still pulsing with electricity was a bad idea. Once Midoriya had dried off, put on some fresh clothes, given rubber kitchen gloves to wear as precautionary protection by his mother, and the electrician called to come down and fix the blown-up fuse box, mother and son sat in the living room, still without power, the only source of light coming from the window, where the rain still poured beyond. Few moments passed in silence. Izuku, what happened? Midoriya glanced at his mother stoically, her irises reflecting the low light from the window. He could see all kinds of emotions in those forest green pools, worry, fear, confusion being the main ones. Let me start from the beginning, Mom. Midoriya recounted everything, starting with the attack from the sludge villain, which horrified Inko, All Might rescuing him. Here, Inko was surprised that her son's idol had saved him, his second near-death experience clinging onto the number one hero's leg as he took off into the air. This horrified Inko, again, and All Might telling him that he couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Hearing this, Inko's expression fell, her eyes becoming watery. Izuku, I'm so sorry. Nonplussed, Midoriya continued, there's more. Wiping away the tears in her eyes, Inko listened as her son carried on. She was left speechless with horror when Midoriya described getting struck by lightning after retreating to a park to cry, recounting the unbearable pain and the surreal feeling of his body shutting down, one organ after the other. Then, how were you revived, Izuku? I think I was struck by a second bolt, Midoriya replied. I felt the impact, but it was different. I felt the electricity seep into my body. Something opened up inside me, and then, everything began to lighten. Suddenly, I could breathe again, and then my eyes opened. Moment of silence followed. Only the rain pouring outside provided some ambience. How do you feel, now? Honestly, I feel normal, Midoriya replied, like the electricity has become a part of me. I can't control it, but it's there. Again, silence followed. Inko, in all honesty, had no idea how to go about this. Her son had just been killed, then resurrected, and now possessed what could be electric or lightning quirk. Things happened one after the other, so quickly. It left her no chance to make head or tail of things. I think we should go see a specialist, Inko suggested. Maybe we can find some answers from them. If that works, Midoriya shrugged. But what about the electrician? He can only come tomorrow, his mother replied. Let's go, dear. Inko got up from the sofa, her son following immediately. Suddenly, the teen stopped. Actually, Mom, there's something I need to say. You can tell me as we go, dear, Inko replied as she grabbed her purse. What is it about? Here, Midoriya hesitated, eyes glancing downwards for a moment. Steeling himself, he continued, it's about it's about Bakugo. It was a miracle that Midoriya and his mother were able to get to the hospital in one piece. Why? Because while on the road, Midoriya spilled the beans on all of the bullying, insults, physical abuse and ostracizing he was forced to endure for the past 10 years at the hands of his former childhood playmate and his lackeys, all because he was quirkless. He even confessed how Bakugo told him to kill himself if he so desperately wanted a quirk. His mother, expectedly, flew into a shocked outrage. In part due to the rain, they had several near accidents when Inko's disbelief and fury made her almost lose control of the wheel. Would-be collisions, rear ends, and sideswipes with other vehicles, trees, lampposts, pedestrians and the like were barely avoided as the car swerved and braked through the wet streets. Midoriya was able to talk his mother down from an interrogation until they got to the hospital, which ensured their safe arrival. Now, after registering, mother and son sat in the half-filled waiting room. And the expected interrogation, albeit hushed since they were in a public place, began. How long has this been going on? Since the diagnosis that I was quirkless, Mom. Didn't you tell anyone? A teacher? I tried. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. Why didn't you tell me? Here, Midoriya hesitated. His brow furrowed slightly. I didn't wish to be a further burden. It was a cliched answer when victims of bullying are asked why didn't they go to their parents or adult figures for help. But Inko understood it just as well as any other reason. Things hadn't been smooth since her husband walked out on them when her son was diagnosed as quirkless. Between raising her son and working to keep them afloat financially, she couldn't be there for him all the time. Furthermore, Midoriya had always been an independent child, always wanting to take control of the situation himself without any help. It made sense that Midoriya kept this terrible secret hidden for so many years. But at the same time, it broke Inko's heart to hear of the pain her son had to go through alone. "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I wish I could have been there for you more often." "It's not your fault, Mom. The world isn't perfect. We can't have everything that we want." Hearing her son speaking in such calm tones temporarily abated the barely repressed urge to storm to the Bakugo household and literally tear apart that piece of explosive shit for harming her son for so long. Brutal revenge aside though, the main priority was her son, and how they were to go about the current situation. The number on an overhead LED screen flashed Midoriya's number slip. The door to the specialist's office opened. A middle-aged man with receding hair poked his head out into the room. "Midoriya-san?" Mother and son got up from their seats. The specialist opened the door wider, letting them in and closing the door behind them. "Now, what seems to be the matter?" Inko needed no further prompting. "My son appeared to have developed a quirk quite suddenly." "Really?" The specialist, a Dr. Kajikura, started writing on a pad as he turned to Midoriya. "How old are you?" 15. "That's extremely late," Dr. Kajikura remarked. "Could you tell me what happened?" Midoriya repeated the story, save for the emotional bits. The more he recounted, the higher Dr. Kajikura's eyebrows rose. By the time he had finished, the good doctor was left completely floored. "Remarkable, extremely remarkable." "What is it, Kajikura-san?" Inko asked. "By all accounts, your son should have been dead. But instead, he is alive and well, and the lightning has given a quirk through external means." "Has this happened before?" "Yes, but extremely rarely. There have been a few recorded cases of people getting their quirks from external circumstances rather than the usual manifestation at the average age of 4. But these are usually man-made events. Your son could be the first case where the external manifestation is from nature itself. This, Midoriya-san, is unprecedented, and if I have your consent, I would like to perform a few tests with your son to determine the nature of his quirk." Inko hesitated, glancing at her son, who just shrugged nonchalantly. "All right, you have my consent." What followed was a series of practical and medical tests to determine the nature of Midoriya's new quirk. The practical tests were painful, not for Midoriya, but for Dr. Kajikura, as the teen had no control of his new quirk when the gloves came off. However, it was the medical scans that provided the most shock. After nearly electrocuting the doctor over a dozen times, Midoriya underwent a full-body X-ray scan, which left Dr. Kajikura stumped. Further tests like pulse measurement and reflex gauging exacerbated the man's bewilderment. "I'm at a loss for words, Midoriya-san. What did you find?" "Your son is living off electricity." There was a beat of silence. "Living off electricity?" Inko repeated. "Yes," Dr. Kajikura nodded. "The X-ray scan showed the inside of your son's body to be completely filled with electrical currents. As you can see here, the doctor pressed some keys on the keyboard attached to a screen, which popped up a video feed of Midoriya's insides. The currents are running throughout his body." "But what has this got to do with Izuku living off this electricity?" asked Inko. This is where things venture into the unheard of. Dr. Kajikura zoomed in on one of Midoriya's arteries. You can see the red blood cells moving as they would normally do, if you ignore the smaller bolts of electricity coursing through as well, but he zoomed out and focused on Midoriya's heart. "As you can see, your son's heart is not beating." "I beg your pardon?" "Your son's heart is completely still. No pulse, whatsoever. In normal circumstances, he should have been dead. But it appears as if the currents are acting like a pacemaker, manually taking over the function of his heart. My guesses are that all of his other bodily functions, like breathing, and even his mental functions, here Dr. Kajikura moved to the feet of Midoriya's brain, which was completely enveloped in crackling electricity, are also being stimulated by the electricity. Something clicked in Inko's mind, and she paled slightly. So, you're saying? Grim look flashed over the good doctor's face, your son will need to be careful. Although I am uncertain of the odds, if the electricity within your son's body were to run out, be it from quirk overuse or other means, his body would have no means of support to stay functioning, and he could die. Utter silence. How can we prevent this? Inko asked, with a hint of desperation. Short-term wise, Dr. Kajikura replied, your son will need to have a constant supply of electricity or a voltage source to replenish any electricity that he uses. However, that is not viable long-term. At the same time, if we can look at this. The doctor moved the feet downwards to over Midoriya's chest. He pointed to an area in between his lungs, where it appeared to contain a glowing solid of energy where a good chunk of the electric bolts appeared to be coalescing within, before spreading out to the rest of his body. The scan was just barely able to pick it up. Judging from how the electric bolts are behaving, I believe this is the core where all the electricity is sourced. Now, we have had cases where a core is central to a person's quirk. Unfortunately, no two cores are the same, so we don't know much about them. The only defining characteristic that applies to all cores is that the more it is built, the stronger it becomes. I think in this case, building up the core is the only long-term plan to ensure your son's survival. The car ride home was a somber one. It was still raining, although the lightning and thunder appeared to have ceased. Traffic had gotten worse with the wet weather and the evening rush home, reduced to slow-moving congestions with horns blaring constantly. In contrast, all was silent with Midoriya and his mother. The older woman drummed her fingers against the steering wheel, while the teen stared off into space, glancing downwards. Dr. Kajikura's words hung heavily on them both. He had spoken about other things about what the electricity had done to Midoriya's body. But those paled in significance to the fact that the teen's body was now running literally on nothing but electrical currents. Inko, naturally, was in the midst of an emotional roller coaster. On the one hand, she was ecstatic that her son finally had a quirk to call his own. However, that joy was overshadowed by the worry that her son's life now depends on electricity, fear of what would happen should that electricity run out, and the underlying anger at a certain Bakugo Katsuki for being the catalyst for this entire debacle. Midoriya, on the other hand, was in deep thought. He was definitely unnerved that he was basically running on a finite reserve, like a human battery. But the notion itself didn't scare or intimidate him. On the contrary, it fascinated him that he resembled Frankenstein's monster in terms of function, using electricity to come alive. But unlike Frankenstein's monster, this electricity was now his to possess. He still had no idea how to control it, but wasn't that a possibility that could open so many doors for him? He could imagine how much he could do if he bent the electric currents keeping him alive into an immense power. Could he be a hero now, then? Was the possibility now within reach? And yet, Midoriya felt something was not quite right. He couldn't put his finger on it, the feeling of unsettled emotion that was out of place amongst his rationalized thoughts. Midoriya looked up, and did a double take. The suburb they were driving through was unfamiliar. This was clearly not the way home. Mom? Where are we? We're going to see Auntie Mitsuki, Inko replied, eyes never turning away from the road. I need to have a word with her about Katsuki. Ah, so that's what it was. That's what was unsettling him. Midoriya stayed silent for several moments, before turning to his mother. Mom, pull over. The car stopped. The rain continued to pour outside, hitting the windscreen and getting swept away from the wipers. What's the matter, Izuku? There's no need to make a scene there, Mom. Let's go home. What are you talking about? What Katsuki did is beyond reprehensible. He shouldn't be allowed to continue going about unpunished like this, Inko countered with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. I know, I'm not refuting that, Midoriya countered stoically, but I have a different approach to this, and I wish for you to hear me out, Mom. Inko went silent, waiting to hear her son's reasoning. Bakoku is the kind of egotistical arsehole who does not get affected by scoldings or rebukes, the teen explained, looking out of the windscreen. Getting Aunt Mitsuki or yourself to scream at him will not do anything. He is so convinced that he is right, that he will never believe that he could be wrong. No, what is needed to punch a hole through his thick skull is something even more traumatic. Midoriya turned back to his mother. Earlier today, he told me to kill myself if I wanted a quirk. I've decided, I'll give him what he wants. Inko's eyes widened. Izuku, you see can't mean dash. Not in that sense, Mom, Midoriya interrupted, but first, can I ask you? Relieved her son was not going to do anything rash, Inko waited for his question. What was your maiden name before you got married? The rain lasted through the night, only stopping with the dawn of the new day, a Saturday. But the sky remained gray and ominous, casting a somber gloom over the suburbs. Midoriya got up as he normally would, but he knew this Saturday was far different from past weekends. Change was in the air. The status quo was about to be shaken up. Breakfast was a standard affair. But what should have been an entire day filing through blogs, videos, and social media following heroes and jotting furiously into notebooks, Midoriya had places to be. First, his middle school. It was admittedly a bit strange to see how empty the school was during the weekend, save for the administration staff who came in for a half day of work. Yet that little detail had no hold on the green-haired teen, who with his mother, had a last-minute appointment with the school's principal concerning his enrollment. Basically speaking, Midoriya was pulling out of school. The meeting was short and impersonal. Save for a question about his scars from the principal, for which Midoriya quite pointedly replied, considering how you never bothered to ensure students like me are safe from bullying and ostracizing, I find it quite surprising that you bothered to take an interest in my well-being just as I am planning to pull out of your godforsaken school, which pretty much summed up the entire purpose of their visit. No further questions were asked. Midoriya's name was removed from the school's database, and he was officially no longer a student. Leaving behind a rather scandalized principal, mother and son left and went on to their second destination, the citizens' registrar office. 2 hours later, Midoriya emerged with a new legal identity. Akatani Makumo. Quirk, Green Lightning. Akatani was his mother's maiden name, and Makumo came from a moment of inspiration sparked from a stock image of a thunderstorm over a turbulent ocean that randomly popped up with an online ad the night before. The process was swift and efficient, as with his withdrawal from his former school. And Akatani left the office with a new ID card and passport. But as with tropes, a new name must come with a new look. So it was to the hair salon after lunch. There, forest green gave way to a royal purple, and one hair dyeing procedure later, Akatani returned home a different person. Now, he could get to planning. There were 3 main priorities on Akatani's list. 1. Learn to control his quirk and expand on its uses. 2. Build up his body strength, stamina, and agility. And 3. Pass the UA entrance exam. And he had 10 months to accomplish all 3. Akatani devised a simple timetable to organize his plan for the entrance exam. 3 days, he would research on the abilities of electric quirk users, hero and villain, find out how to build up his core, apply theoretical knowledge into practice, and hone up until both his quirk and core become second nature and an inseparable part of him. The remaining 4 days, exercise and workout, hard. His theoretical study commenced the moment he came home from the salon. He holed up in his room, listing down the names of every hero, pro and underground, and known villains who possessed electric-type quirks or quirks of a similar nature. After dinner, he went back to those names, and broke down and analyzed the properties, strengths, weaknesses and application of their quirks, organizing his notes into notebooks dedicated to common details. It was long past midnight when he finally convinced himself to go to bed. The next day saw Akatani make a trip down to the local library, bag filled with empty notebooks and a holder bursting to the brim with pens and mechanical pencils. He spent the entire day within the air-conditioned reading rooms, going through book after book on the history of quirks, research studies on electric-type quirks, and informational books on various martial arts, offensive and defensive styles, and how to combine one's quirk with one's fighting skills. Akatani was, unfortunately, forced to leave when the library closed for the night. But that didn't mean he was going home empty-handed. He loaned out the 10 books he hadn't been able to cover during the day, and went home with a much heavier bag. While it certainly was a struggle for Akatani's scrawny frame, it did make him think about the best places for him to work out and build his muscle mass. Gym memberships were expensive investments, and he didn't want to add another financial burden on his mother. So what could he do? The bus Akatani was on took a left turn. He looked out the window. And the answer was right there, rushing past him. Beach. Well, if one was being generous. And decided to ignore the fact that it resembled more of a landfill with mountains of garbage than a beach. But for Akatani, this was the perfect place. The bus passed a moss-covered, weather-beaten wooden sign. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. He'd better take note of the name, Akatani thought to himself. For the day after next, he'll be back. But before he could take on Dagoba Beach, there was one more important thing Akatani had to begin focusing on. His core. It was the very reason why he was alive today. It was therefore imperative that he find out everything he could about quirk cores, for not just his future, but also for his very survival. Several of the books he brought back from the library were on quirk cores war, whatever recorded information anyone has about cores, beyond what Dr. Kajikura had already mentioned. One book told of a legend that the first ever quirk user had a core. Another listed the individuals who were said to possess cores, and what great, or terrible, deeds they went on to make. A lot of theories overlapped, supported or refuted one another. Some cores were benign and gentle, others were more violent and volatile. But there was widespread agreement on one thing: there was occasionally a core that gave its host an almost divine-like power. The sheer magnitude of such power was unimaginable to most, only described through the actions of the person who wielded them. But while this knowledge was good and all, what Akatani was looking for was information on how to control his core, integrate its power into his body and quirk, and be able to call upon it at will. That came from the last book in the pile, covers littered with crease lines and pages yellowed with time. Akatani began reading. The first exercise involved having first contact with one's core. Without this starting point, establishing a connection with it would be next to impossible. Easier said than done though, since the instructions merely said, open your heart, open your soul. Be one with what defines you. First contact with your core will be within reach. And when one gets vague instructions, you get a lot of failed attempts. Akatani tried all manner of means to open his heart and soul. Sitting in a lotus position under the running showerhead, lying down on his bed with eyes closed, lying prone with eyes closed, standing dead straight with even breathing. All he felt was darkness, discomfort, mattress, and getting drenched. Nothing, absolutely nothing. I'm doing this wrong, he thought to himself as he stared up at his bedroom ceiling, but what is it? Seconds ticked by. Birds chirped outside the bedroom window. Akatani raised a hand over his face. A crackle of jade green electricity bolted across his arm to his fingertips, before disappearing. Maybe? It was worth a shot. Akatani relaxed his entire body as he laid back against the mattress. He closed his eyes, evened out his breathing, and tried to visualize the electricity coursing through him. For several minutes, nothing happened. But Akatani persisted. Finally, after 15 minutes of darkness, a small crackle of jade green electricity dances across the void. Akatani mentally cheered, before relaxing himself again. He had to repeat it, multiple times, until he got the hang of it. He tried again. The same crackle of electricity manifested itself again. He kept going, trying to expand the mental connection. Slowly, a second crackle joined the first, then a third, then a fourth. Akatani kept pushing, and eventually, the entire void was teeming with crackles of electricity, big and small. The field of electrical power seemed to expand bigger and bigger, until suddenly it went supernova. For an undetermined amount of time, all Akatani could see was white. It persisted even when he opened his eyes. His room had vanished, only white as far as his eyes could see. Akatani realized he was lying on a hard surface, though it appeared to be nothing, just white. He slowly picked himself up, and tried to orient himself with this unfamiliar realm he had just entered. What is this place? He took a step forward, feeling the hard surface underneath. Then another step. He was soon walking, but to where, he didn't know. He knew he was moving, but his surroundings remained the same, white all around, uninterrupted. Akatani didn't know how long he walked. But suddenly, he stopped. Something, in the distance, interrupted the vast white. It looked like a green dot. Akatani sped up his steps. The closer he got, the bigger it became. At a close enough distance, he could make out what it was. It appeared to be a sphere made out of some clear, gelatinous-like substance. It was enveloped in a field of jade green, cracking electricity, sparkling underneath it. It hovered at about Akatani's chest level, unmoving. There was no doubt about it. This was his core. Akatani was enthralled by the sheer beauty of it. He reached out to his core, wanting to touch it. Only for the sphere to start trembling, the electric currents crackling sharply. Akatani pulled his hand back, just as the sphere began shaking wildly, and the electric currents shooting out in all directions. There was a bright flash, and then his eyes flew open, and he was back in his room again. For several moments, he laid still on his bed, breathing hard from the rush that was now slowly leaving him like water flowing down the drain. He glanced about, checking to see if he was really back in the real world, before summoning the energy to sit up. He turned to the instructional book, lying idly on the floor beside his bed. Akatani picked it up, and flipped to the next exercise. First contact will be volatile. Unfamiliarity remains dominant. Practice makes perfect, so too will the connection become. Well, looks like I have another reason to head down to Dagoba Beach tomorrow. The sun hadn't even begun to rise over the horizon into the new day, but already, a lone figure had gotten off the first bus at the stop closest to Dagoba Beach. In the silence of the early morning, Akatani hurried towards the polluted beach, backpack filled with packets of rubbish bags and rope. The sound of waves crashing against the shore and mountains of garbage greeted him as he arrived, seagulls cawing overhead. The teen stared at the years of accumulated waste and pollution in front of him. This was going to be a Herculean task, even more so since he only had 10 months to clean up the entire beach, and he wasn't the strongest person on the block. But if he wanted to get into UA, he had to do it. Sliding his backpack off, Akatani pulled out the first packet of rubbish bags. It was time to get to work. He started off with the piles furthest away from the water. Now, it would have been child's play to pick out the objects that were small and light. But Akatani wanted to test out a technique he learned from his research. Electrotelekinesis, or the ability to pull objects to him using his electrical currents. Many attempts followed, all unsuccessful. Sometimes, nothing came forth. Other times, only a crackle appeared. And a few times, the burst of electricity threw him backwards, but otherwise did nothing to the garbage. Akatani groaned, occasionally of pain, but he picked himself up after each failed attempt. He had to get this to work. But Akatani wasn't stupid, or foolhardy. He knew that something was not quite right yet, as he resorted to manually picking up the smaller objects and tossing them into the rubbish bag. Thinking back to the day before, and his failed attempt to connect with his core, he came to conclusion that just like his core, his quirk itself was volatile and unstable. He had to continually use it to get a firm grasp of it, and perhaps along the way, he'll fully integrate himself with his core. As he set off for home at mid-afternoon, putting away 3 filled rubbish bags by the collection point, Akatani made a slight change in his schedule. He would devote a half-day to mental and emotional building, cutting back on his workout and cleaning days by the same amount. Week later, at last, there was some progress. Akatani's continuous practice has strengthened his control of his electricity to pick up small and lightweight objects, similar to how his mother's quirk worked. This advancement had also allowed for him to finally make contact with his core, albeit for only a single second. Nonetheless, it was a small victory to feel the smooth and crackling surface of his core for that moment. It spurred him further, to become even better. As the days progressed, changes were made to his workout and cleaning routine. Instead of taking the bus, Akatani jogged to Dagoba Beach from his home and back. On the second week, a public gym opened 2 streets away from his home. Akatani would spend 2 days out of the 3.5 days dedicated to physical activity there, following a strict workout regimen he created from researching on the internet. The remaining time he would spend at Dagoba, moving on to bigger and heavier pieces of junk to clear away. Of course, Akatani wasn't able to come home completely unscathed all the time. When handling piles of rubbish that were at least twice his height, accidents were bound to happen. From unstable pieces of junk to small avalanches, Akatani had been lucky to come away with only bruises and scratches so far. But unless he planned for a way to dodge falling objects, it was only a matter of time before he would be risking serious injury or even death. And he would have gotten to that point, had his instincts not unlocked another of his abilities in the moment of danger. Akatani was busy moving a broken rack out of a pile when suddenly, he heard things falling and bouncing off one another. He looked up, and almost shit his pants. The pile had become top-heavy, the weaker base giving way and crumbling under the weight of the top. Another avalanche was happening, only this time, heavy objects like broken electronics and large-sized items were raining towards him. Akatani felt his entire body seize up, seeing imminent death hurtling towards him. But just as he was about to be crushed from the falling trash, he felt his feet leave the ground. There was an immense crash as the junk landed onto the beach one after the other. Akatani watched the sand get kicked up in clouds as the rumble echoed out into the coast, followed by the sand clouds as they billowed out from the impact spot before dying back down, all from hovering several feet above the water, the lower half of his body enveloped in a sparking aura of green electric bolts. Huh. This should be interesting, Akatani thought to himself nonchalantly. The weeks bled into months, and many changes were taking place. Dagoba Beach was slowly, but surely, being cleaned up. The piles of trash slowly diminished as they disappeared, one by one, opening up the beach a little more with each passing day. Akatani was, by now, noticing the changes months of hard work had done to him. A combination of working out, jogging, pushing, pulling, dragging and lifting trash of all sizes away has built his once scrawny form into defined, strong muscles. Once impossible to lift objects were now as easy to carry as if they were made of air. His stamina and agility had also vastly improved, honed from countless runs from home to the beach and back, dodging falling junk, and practicing martial arts moves at both the beach and the public gym. He let his hair grow out, letting his fringe fall over the right side of his face and tying up the back into a ponytail. He had also made significant advancements with his quirk. The months saw the improvement of Akatani's current abilities and the unlocking of new ones. He was now able to blow things apart with his electric bolts, though that is currently only limited to soft items like cotton or fabric. Hard items like metals were still being practiced, manipulate the force and frequency of electrical attacks, from short bursts to long sweeps, craft his electricity into shapes. Akatani figured a ball shape would be a good attack technique, and he was in the process of working out how to send his electricity to attack a wider area than just in one direction. And how to form shields with it, alongside using his electricity to fly, absorbing electricity from lightning strikes and power sources and reining it in so he didn't give others a nasty shock. But there was also one downside to this period of hard work and determination. Namely, Akatani's emotions and socialization. The past month saw him having any meaningful conversation with only one person, his mother. Akatani saw no need for him to socialize with anyone else. After all, didn't no one want to have anything to do with him because he was quirkless? And even though he had a quirk, why bother wasting time socializing when the UA entrance exam was a bigger priority? It may have been mostly logic, with a hint of pettiness, but Akatani closed himself off socially from the world. In turn, his emotions stagnated and froze over, his heart grew cold, and his aura turned distant and unapproachable. But even if Akatani knew he was turning into an Ice King, he didn't give two hoots about it. All he cared about was cleaning up Dagobah and getting into UA. Finally, after months of arduous effort and backbreaking work, and only 3 days before the entrance exam, he was done. Akatani moved the last piece of junk, a broken refrigerator, to the trash collection point, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. Tossing it onto the small pile of trash already there, he wiped the sweat from his brow and turned back towards the beach. It was beautiful. Light glistened against the calm surface of the water, changing shape with the waves as they rolled and splashed onto the shore. The sand sparkled under the same light like diamonds, amidst a vast plain of a light gold. The air smelled of spray and sea salt, no more of the rotting, putrid, foul odors from years of accumulated pollution. This was nature's creation at its finest, with nothing human to disrupt its beauty. Akatani hopped off the pavement, sliding down to the sand. It felt clean now, unmarred by the filth that once piled high in this place. He stepped out halfway between the small slope and the water's edge, gazing silently out into the horizon as the sun continued its rise into the new day. He sat down onto the sand, eyes never leaving the sunrise. He felt accomplished, elated that he had reached his goal of cleaning up the beach. But he was also tired. He had gotten up in the early hours, when it was still dark, to get to the beach and clear away the last vestiges of garbage in time for the sunrise. Call him dramatic or sentimental, but Akatani wanted to catch the first rays of sunlight dawn upon the beach in its new, clean state, something that had never happened since the last time the beach was cleaned up. He just wanted some scenery, so sue him. Beautiful view or not, Akatani was exhausted. Feeling a bit off-kilter, he laid back onto the sand. No sooner had he felt the shifting granules beneath him, he was out like the light. For several moments, all was still. Then, came a relatively big wave. It crashed onto the shore, racing towards Akatani and splashing over him completely. As the wave receded, a single crackle of electricity jumped from his navel into the center of his chest where his core lay, followed by another one from his right arm, and another. Within seconds, his form was completely enveloped by crackling electricity, as the world seemed to fade away. Akatani woke up. Immediately, he knew he was in the mystical plane where his core resided. But there was one crucial difference. All around him, where it should have been white, was filled with crackling bolts of his electricity. And they all appeared to be converging on one single spot. His core. This time, Akatani made no delay as he got up, and followed the direction the electricity was crackling towards. Just as it had been in all the previous times he had traveled into this realm, the sphere that was his core was in the same spot. Only this time, all of the electric currents were converging into a bigger, spherical field around it. He felt completely familiar with the situation. He had lost count already, but at least once a day, he would slide into this plane, and try to bond with his core over and over again. It had been slow going, but over time, his core had stopped shying away from him and propelling him back into the mortal realm. The connection allowed became longer, and Akatani had been able to hold it in his hands long enough to try and move it, but until now, that was all he was able to do before he was kicked out. Now, after honing his skills and strength for a full 10 months, he hoped it was enough for the core to accept him and bond with him completely. Slowly, Akatani reached forward. His hands gingerly passed through the electrical field, and cupped the spherical shape of his core. Just like always, it felt smooth, like he was holding a crystal ball. So far, everything's fine. Then, he carefully retracted his hands, pulling the sphere out of the field. It phased through with no sudden movements. Once it had cleared through, Akatani hesitated, expecting to get thrown out of the realm, but nothing happened. Releasing a relieved sigh, Akatani stared at the glistening sphere in his hands, and brought it into his chest. The moment it touched his skin, it started to glow. Startled, Akatani almost dropped the sphere, as it, on its own accord, phased into his chest. The moment the sphere disappeared into him, the realm started to shift. The empty spherical field where the core once resided appeared to collapse into itself, before bursting out in several different directions as individual electrical currents. They danced around wildly, before converging onto Akatani's chest, on the exact same spot where the core had phased through earlier. The teen had no time to react, as the buildup of energy exploded in another supernova, tearing the realm apart in a flash of white. Meanwhile, the sleeping residents near Dagoba Beach were rudely shaken from their slumber, as a powerful burst of electricity exploded from a point on the beach and spread outwards in all directions in a shockwave of disruptive chaos. For several miles inland, fuse boxes exploded, electrical fixtures shattered, appliances hooked up to outlets burst into flames, wires melted, and whole systems like traffic lights went into overload and shut down. For the same radius out into the ocean, any undersea life swimming too close to the surface was electrocuted and killed, their smoldering bodies floating to the surface and becoming the breakfast of thrilled seagulls. The shockwave dissipated, only for mayhem to take over. Smoke alarms went off, confused shouts and screams echoed as power to much of the district went down. Back at the beach, oblivious to the chaos he'd just caused, Akatani opened his eyes, once again breathing hard as the rush from seconds prior receded with the ocean's waves. Slowly, he picked himself up. Still dripping wet, he stared down at his hands. If what happened back in the realm meant anything, Akatani willed electricity to appear over his hands and arms. Almost immediately, the scars running along his arms glowed green, and crackles of electricity ran up and down the length. He then raised his arms out towards the ocean, compressing the electricity into balls, and on will, fired them out into the horizon. Watching the balls of electricity disappear into the distance, Akatani glanced back down on his hands and arms, still glowing and crackling with electricity. His lips twitched upwards the tiniest bit. He was heading for UA.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.